Percival Lowell, who was one of these guy who had so much money that there was a town in Massachusetts named for him, named for his family. And his sister was a poet, so that tells you, people with way too much money on their hands because they couldn't afford to be a poet. And after he traveled around the world and wrote books about Japan, he decided he was fascinated with Mars, and he was going to look for life on Mars. And he rode the train out to California and got off at Flagstaff. Actually came down here and looked around, but he came during one of the rainy months and decided, no, this is a terrible place for astronomy. Went back to Flagstaff. In the 1890s, the Arizona Territory founded the university here, 20 years before they became a state. And there is still the one original building on campus. Basically, the road we just turned off is Campbell, and if you go, a mile that way, that's how long the campus is. It's about a half mile wide. It was founded in the 1890s. Basically, Tucson got the university, and Phoenix got the state capital. That's how they divided it up. In the 19-teens, people were noticing that the skies were dark here and clear most of the time. And a woman named Mrs. Stewart donated money to start an observatory, which was out here on this part of campus, which was so far away from anything that it was completely dark there. And the building of the original dome and telescope was still on campus. The telescope was long since removed. This became a center for astronomy. And the astronomy continued with, pretty well up through to the end of the war. After World War II, this area boomed, and of course, with the invention of air conditioning, or refrigeration, as they called it, because before then, people would cool their houses with swamp coolers. And I'm old enough to remember swamp coolers. There were a number of notable astronomers that came here through the 50s and into the 60s. One of the most notable was a fellow named Bart Bok, B-O-K. And if anybody remembers, the president of Harvard was Derek Bok. He was a cousin. If there's anybody here who's a music fan, there was a folk musician who would sing about Maine fishermen, Gordon Bok. He was also a cousin. Bart Bok was famous for discovering globules in the Magellanic Clouds called Bok globules. And he brought out here and really was successful in getting government grants to build up the astronomy department. Bart Bok came from the Netherlands. He went to Leiden. He was a student there in the 20s. A fellow student of his was Gerard Kuiper. And I don't know exactly which way the story goes, but the story was that one of them, they were both fascinated in astronomy. One of them, when he took his general exams, aced everything except, quantum physics or some branch of physics that he would never need to know as an astronomer. And he talked the committee into letting him pass even though he'd failed this part. And they said, well, we'll do it this once, but we'll never do it again. And the next year, the other of the two did the same thing, and he was failed, and he had to go and spend another year learning the stuff that he didn't need to know. And they hated each other ever after. Well, Gerard Kuiper wound up eventually at the University of Chicago. And at the University of Chicago in the 1950s, Kuiper was some of these guys who was kind of interested in everything. Step back to Percival Lowell. I'm turning this into a really long story because I'm killing time. just so you know, I know what I'm doing. Percival Lowell was fascinated with Mars and canals on Mars. Where did the idea of canals on Mars come from? It actually goes back to a Jesuit. The greatest Jesuit astronomer you've never heard of. I got another 5 minutes of story. This is great. The greatest Jesuit astronomer you've never heard of is a fellow named Angelo Secchi. And Secchi actually had studied physics, but he was kicked out of Rome in 1848 with all the revolutions, went first to England to a little school called Stonyhurst, which is a school that Chris Corbally went to an elite Chris tomorrow. And then from there to Georgetown, where they had an observatory. But he looked at astronomy from the point of view of a physicist. Up to that time, astronomy was the measurement of the position of the stars. And why do you have a telescope? So that you could see a faint star exactly crossing the meridian. You checked the time when it crossed, and that was, to this day, we have that direction as in hour angles, because that's how they measure the positions of the stars, the exact time compared to sidereal time. At that time, there was a famous philosopher named Comte who said, it's interesting, there is a category of knowledge that we know exists but we can never have. For instance, who knows what a star is made out of? We will never know because we can never get to a star to measure it, right? You can't grab a piece and put it back in the lab. We know it must be made of something, but it is impossible for us to ever know. And indeed, it's even improper for an astronomer to ask that question, because we'll never know. Well, Secchi, following physics, follows in 1859 the work of Bunsen and Kircher of taking spectra of hot gases and identifying the lines in the spectra with the chemical composition. He builds a big prism to put in front of his telescope, which incidentally is on the roof of the St. Ignatius Church in Rome. If you've ever been to Rome, there's this marvelous church the Jesuits have near the old Jesuit college. And you go inside and you look at the dome, and it's kind of dirty, but it's an impressive dome. And then when you walk under it, the dome feels like it's falling on you, because it's not a real dome. It's a flat roof that they painted in perspective, Trump doily. Well, when Secchi went back to Rome after the revolutions were over, and they made him the director of the observatory at the Roman College, they said, and here's this marvelous tower, you can put your telescope. And he's going, the tower's going to shake in the wind. Not a good place for a telescope. I want a place that's high but solid, like on top of the roof of this church that had big pillars to hold the weight of a dome, but they never built the dome. So he built this telescope, fabulous telescope, and he devised a prism that he put in front of the objective lens. Suddenly every star is a streak, and he can measure and see the lines in the stars by eye, not photography, and record them by eye, not photography. And after seeing 5,000 of these stars, he classified them into small groups, which is the basis of the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. You know, he had 5 categories, and they developed 10 out of that. But he's the first guy to do it. Where was I going to follow this? Secchi was doing spectroscopy. Secchi changed the nature of the question from where are the stars to what are the stars. That was, a big breakthrough in the end of the 19th century. Canals, and going eventually to canals. He asks the same question about the planets. Before then, people would measure the positions of orbits to get the orbit to one more decimal place, to work out the mathematical theory of the orbit that much better. He looked at the planet with this beautiful telescope and looked at its surface. And he wrote the very first book of planetary science, which is about what do we see when we look at the surface of a planet. He even took spectra and found carbon in the atmospheres of Jupiter and Uranus. But on Mars, he sees bright and dark markings, and the way things that he describes are real. In the center of the planet is a large triangular area. This is now known as Syrtis Major. And there are bright areas and dark areas. And the bright areas seem to act like channels between the dark areas. The word in Italian for channel is canale. Secchi dies in 1878. Another Italian astronomer of that era, Schiaparelli, who was a great, almost a student, but certainly somebody who greatly admires Secchi, continued the work, actually came up with a very detailed map of Mars with names for the different dark regions and light regions, which is the nomenclature we still use today. But looking at Mars over and over and over again, he had the optical illusion of seeing thin lines, which he said this is another kind of canonic, another kind of shadow. Percival Lowell, remember Percival Lowell, the guy up in Flagstaff? Percival Lowell publishes books with these thin lines, saying you notice that there are no clouds in the atmosphere of Mars, but it's got pole caps, and it's got these thin lines, and it's got seasons because it's tilted, and when the pole cap shrinks, the dark areas further to the south grow. Clearly, the Martians have created these artificial straight channels to carry the water from the poles to irrigate and make these crops grow on the dark surfaces. Clearly. It fits all the data. It must be true. So, hello. That's all right. We're fast, massively early. And I'm telling a long story. So
Excellent. I'd rather be here, but I'm going to go set up. I'll be 5 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. So, he publishes this in 1895. 2 years later, H.G. Wells publishes War of the Worlds. And by the early 1910s, everybody's convinced there's life on Mars. You can look at the number of papers published decade by decade with the word Mars, divided by the number of papers with the word stuck to normalize how many astronomy papers have been published. And lots of papers about Mars until about 1910, and it craters. Because no respectable person is going to be involved with studying planets because you're a goofball like Percival Lowell talking about, people on Mars. He completely discredits the field. By the 1950s, the only person who's interested in planets, just because he's kind of crazy, is Gerard Kuiper. In 1956, at the IAU meeting in the Netherlands, he gets up and he says, we've got all of these modern telescopes and better photography. It's about time we started studying the moon again, studying planets. Nobody listens to him because nobody does that, because studying planets is so discredited that no reputable astronomer will waste their time doing it. There was one young guy in the audience. His name was Whittaker, Ewan Whittaker. He was British. He was a technician at the Royal Observatory. He was not a PhD. His hobby was collecting old moon maps. He was fascinated with the moon. So he went to Kuiper afterwards and said, I'm interested in the moon. I'd like to work. And Kuiper says, well, if you can take a sabbatical year and come and stay with me. So Whittaker goes back to his boss and says, this guy has offered to support me. If you can't take a sabbatical year. If you go, you're never coming back. We'll let you have 1 month vacation. So he puts his affairs in order. And on October 5th, 1957, he boards the BOAC flight from England to the United States to work at the Yerkes Observatory with Gerard Kuiper. What's significant about October 5th, 1957? 1 day after Sputnik. He gets there. By the time he lands, Kuiper has already talked the National Aeronautics and Civil Engineering, NACA, which was the predecessor of NASA, into giving him money to study the moon because, by golly, we've got to beat the Russians. He hires on Ewan Whittaker and never looks back. By 1960, Kuiper, who owns the field, has got more money than he knows what to do with, and he makes a deal with the University of Arizona to start the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory, which is not a part of the astronomy department because Bach, his enemy, is the head of the astronomy department. So this road that we're going to walk up, Cherry Avenue, the Lunar Lab is on one side, and the astronomy department is on the other side, and they would never talk to each other. I was a student here in the 70s, and it was rare even then that they would talk to each other. We will hear more about Ewan Whitaker when we talk to the Imaging Center, because he was instrumental in setting that up and in doing imaging of the moon and imaging of planets. He was one of the people who taught me when I was a grad student. Kuiper himself died in '73. I didn't get to it until '75, so he was already gone by the time I was. But all of that money meant that, and all of that NASA money meant that suddenly planetary science sprung up like a weed, and the astronomers hated it because now they had all this money and a bunch of geology people studying planets rather than astronomers. It has been a long time for the two groups to actually slowly speak to each other. And it still goes on to this day, because the people who study exoplanets, there are those who study it from the point of view of astronomers and those who study it from the point of view of planets, and they still have a hard time talking to each other. So that's my story. That's the setup for why they started building telescopes.